Welcome to the Energy Desk, a limited series from Mobius Risk Group on the macro and fundamental trends shaping global energy markets. If you like what you hear and you want us to keep this series going, make sure you let us know by following wherever you get your podcasts or dropping a note to Melvin@mobiusriskgroup.com. Let's hop in. All right, Zane, welcome back. Good to have you here for Friday, October 11th recording, and got some good things to talk about.
Yeah, let's start as a kind of a recap of a report you put out earlier this week. I thought it was a very interesting discussion that was had with former Google CEO about fossil fuel demand and really just the tech sector's position on all things green versus the need to ensure they could actually meet the demand that they see coming. So with that, I don't know, give us a broad overview of what you read, what you reported on.
Yeah, so this was a lecture series from this think tank called, the SCSP AI plus Energy Summit. And the speaker for this video was former Google CEO Eric Schmidt. And what I really thought was interesting about this was that he was one of the first direct indications of the tech giant, tech world breaking this barrier from historically being, I say, more exclusively aligned with the IEA's net zero by 2050 kind of policy perspective, where we're trying to limit investment in traditional energies like natural gas. But in this video and this lecture, Eric Schmidt was talking about just the immense energy needs of emerging technology. And really that is just AI. And just as a high level overview, there's two real kind of segments of AI's energy needs. One is your typical data center, just managing how people are interacting with tools. That's called inference in this case for AI. The other one is training computer pre-training. And we've written about that before. And I think people who are interested in the AI world should go and look at some of the stuff that we've put out on the supercomputers and how their power consumption has grown exponentially. But this problem that he's identifying has really cemented this perspective that there's an unrealistic timeline to transition baseload power to something like nuclear. There's an unrealistic expectation that variable renewable energies plus batteries will be developed and satisfy economics in time to meet near-term demand growth from this technology. And so there's a few quotes that I think would really be interesting for listeners, just because this is a guy in the tech industry that is making these comments. He was asked the question about what is AI's real power mix? One of the things that he was talking about is that one, storage, so large scale batteries, the development process for those is really a longer timeline than people are expecting. And two, the current state of the art is limited to short-term storage. So it's more balancing, not, hey, we're going to not have wind and solar for a week or 2 weeks, and we're going to be able to rely on these batteries. And so instead, what he said is that we're running out of base load.
So let me interrupt you there for just a second, just so the listeners are clear. When we talk about balancing and just quantifying that, really you're measuring in a matter of minutes. It's when there's a disruption to the flow of power. Say a power plant goes down. For instance, a coal-fired power plant had an unplanned disruption, and the minutes between that moment when a natural gas-fired peaker were to fire up, not that you are without power, the grid does not go down. However, the available supply, which in some ways is a function of their economics, can spike materially with this significant increase in demand that is expected to be on the near-term horizon. So balancing versus true backup or alternative, maybe is a better word, is really what Alex is talking about here.
Right. And anybody who listened to the chat last week with Rishi, we talked about energy arbitrage and how the battery economics are changing, where you're capturing cheap solar, cheap wind, and you're using that in those peak hours. But returning to what he's mentioning here, and that is the former Google CEO Eric Schmidt. His comment is, and this is a quote, "And we're running out of baseload unless you're willing to build a lot more coal, which we're not willing to do, and more gas, which we are willing to do. I don't see how you can get much above 50% in renewable, which means you're always going to have the intermittency problem between the two, and that problem has to get solved." And so I think that was the first indication. And then the rest of the 45-minute chat just really outlined this demand problem. And from Schmidt's perspective, his quote is, "The fact of the matter is the demand is infinite." And then he goes on to say that this is not a problem that we're going to be solving through conservation, meaning things like AI, a tool like AI that can solve complex problems is a good tool to use to try and identify how you can reduce power consumption from inefficiencies. But to his point, this is a technology that its energy needs are absolutely dwarfing anything that you can get from conservation.
I think there's a lot of historical read-throughs there too. We'll go back to the first time someone was able to flip on a switch and have light that wasn't a fuel, meaning a burning candle, a burning oil. We've become infinitely more efficient. But the problem there, which I think he's pointing out and identifying, is as we become more efficient, it, in theory, creates more availability, which then finds more demand at a price. In other words, we always consume more. So we're talking about the specific sector that he's acknowledging almost in its own ecosystem. AI is part of this growth, this build out, this need for new demand. And it in and of itself will seek conservation efforts. I describe it as an inanimate object. And at the same time, baseload demand growth, meaning just overall power consumption in the world, is likely to grow at a much faster rate than what can be found in consumption reduction.
Right. And I think two final points on just his commentary that really cemented that and broke this tech energy industry barrier was, one, just identifying nuclear is a long-term solution. Batteries are a long-term solution, but the demand problem is more near-term than that. Either of those solutions can really solve. And so his comment on nuclear, for example, is burden of regulations, where it's a very safe technology, but that's not reflected in outdated regulations that are leaving U.S., so domestic markets a little bit vulnerable to saying, okay, so I want to build a new nuclear plant. It's going to take me another 10 years just to get that approved, and then another however long to actually build the unit. So that's one issue.
I'll go with however long. I think we can answer however long. It's another 10 years. So right. That's what we've seen recently with any new nukes. When you're lucky, it's a 10-year process from somebody stuck a shovel in the ground to I'm making power.
Right. And so it's not going to solve the problem that is emerging right now. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the battery storage technology is just not developed for large scale bets that require this baseload capacity. And we talked about some of the domestic supply chain issues for U.S. nuclear and some other research, and definitely recommend people go dig into that if you're interested. And this high level takeaway is that our domestic nuclear fuel supply chain is relatively non-existent. It's mostly owned or operated by folks like Russia or France or insert country here, and two of the four dominant suppliers are adversaries. So there's another issue there from a domestic security perspective that's just going to add some of these regulatory headwinds. So it's just one to really think about. And I think to Schmidt's point, as we've talked about at length, that demand in the near term, at least, is going to have to turn to something like natural gas that we have in abundance.
Yeah, I think one thing that operates in the background in my mind in hearing all of that is Germany has certainly made a move to ensure that they are not a part of the AI revolution when they very well could have been. In one of our previous discussions, you and I, Alex, discussed the changes in the power policy in Germany and how many nuclear-fired power plants they retired. And while our fleet has not fallen by nearly as much, let's say we reduced our capacity by 10% from where it was, say, 20 years ago. Don't quote me on that, or do. I think it's pretty close. When you go and you retire a nuclear fired power plant, you're immediately sending a signal to uranium suppliers that this demand is not going to be there. And Alex just touched on how prolonged that lead time is from the plan to the actual production of the next megawatt of nuclear fired power. And I'm sure if there were enough, certainly governmental bodies that set out to make a concerted push for more nuclear fired power, could we narrow that 10-year window to even cut it in half? Possibly. But the supply of uranium itself is another issue that's going to have to be solved. Waving a magic wand and going out and installing another 100 gigawatts of nuclear fired power capacity around the world is all fun and good. It's like building a grocery store with no food to put on a shelf. It's a nice box with no functionality. So sorry, Germany, not looking good for you on the AI front.
Yeah. And one of the funny comments from that lecture was just that history will record the German decision to shut down their perfectly fine working fission plants. Terrible idea. And I think that's in line how we've talked about that, how German industry has reacted to that. On the fuel side, one of the things that came out this week that is just an indication of maybe this long-term trend, again, long-term, is the U.S. Department of Energy just awarded some contracts for developing a high assay, low enriched uranium supply chain. So that high assay, just to break this down, typical nuclear reactors in the US are running at 5% uranium enrichment. So that's the low enriched uranium, LEU. And this high assay is taking that up from 5% to something more like 15 to 20%. And that use case is specifically for something like a small modular reactor. And some of these Gen 4 reactors, the new frontiers of reactor technology are going to be kicking this up a notch for efficiency and some of these other higher heat management, things like that. So I think that's just a small indication of maybe what's going to be the focus for the U.S. to develop a domestic supply chain.
Which is an interesting, I don't know, I'm certainly a novice when it comes to LEU or the high assay, but I can't help but think a higher concentration of uranium is just an interesting storyline when you pair it with what you mentioned earlier about regulatory approval, as we are certainly on the precipice of things in the Middle East that are putting a lot of focus on Iran's nuclear enrichment programs. So the idea, multiple bodies around the world, some non-governmental, will just be in this game of enriching uranium. I don't know. It feels like a Back to the Future. I don't even know, not a sequel. I don't even know where you're at when you're like episode 5 or 6. But it's there's another interesting obstacle there.
Yeah. And I think the safety fears are valid. The thing with the high assay is that it takes it up to 20%. For a nuclear weapon, that's usually around 90%. So there's still quite a bit of a gap, but it's definitely a risk every time you're kicking that up a notch. But staying within this theme of emerging technology, one of the data points that came out this week that we talked about a little bit on our Intel Brief research was electric vehicles versus hybrids. And I think that one of the interesting trends that I've been watching for the last year or so is this really two sticky problems that are facing EVs and maybe preventing rapid adoption. So one is high relative cost to internal combustion engines. The latest data from this week actually showed that US EV buyers are spending about 16% more on EVs versus essentially the equivalent internal combustion engine version, over 56,000 for an EV versus just over 48,000 for a regular combustion engine vehicle. So that's one. And then range anxiety is the second issue. And so that really comes back to that battery technology issue. So things have improved. As Rishi mentioned last week, the connection between EV manufacturers like Tesla and these utility scale battery storage systems are pretty closely connected, and they're working in concert to try and bring the cost down of those batteries. But the range anxiety issue is still paramount because, one, if you're going for a battery EV, then you are constrained to an undeveloped infrastructure system in the US where we have these pretty ambitious goals to deploy charging infrastructure, but the actual rate of installment is quite slow. And when people see that, they're saying, okay, if I have to go further than, say, 200 miles, how am I going to charge and how long is that going to charge? Because your comparison for a combustion engine vehicle, you're done in minutes versus something like an EV, you're charging for as much as 90 minutes. And so that's two things that are really knocking on the EV market penetration rate. And when we look at that rate, just to provide a little bit more context, this is all government data. And so when we're looking at monthly EV sales, we're seeing that EV sales have grown for sure. And they proceeded at a really rapid rate between really 2020 and 2023. But when we look at the incentives that drove that, one of the interesting things that came out was the National Bureau of Economic Research, so NBER, just released this study that said that 75% of the IRA subsidies, which are driving that adoption, went to consumers who would have purchased an EV anyway. And so the equivalent cost per EV from these government subsidies, so the government spending, essentially went to $32,000 per EV. So mostly covering the equivalent cost of, I'd say, rough number, 60% of the cost of the EV for any incremental EV purchase that wouldn't come from somebody who is going to purchase an EV. That's one indication. The other thing that's really interesting is that EV's annualized market penetration rate, so the rate of market share change, is in 2024, it slowed to 7% from 39% in 2023. And that range anxiety thing is really cemented in this other data point that shows that hybrids, so non-plug-in hybrids, just say like a Toyota, whatever, Tundra, a hybrid that has a battery that is charged by the engine, adoption of those vehicles has actually held relatively steady, holding at basically 37% from 54, so a little bit of a fall off. But when you look at the rate that they're getting into the market, it's really impressive because it's been slow and steady, but now they're basically equivalent with EVs, but the rate of change is just holding strong. So I think that's an indication of where maybe consumer interest is going. I want to be on a system that I'm down to get more, mileage per gallon, but I don't want to be limited to this infrastructure problem. And then that really gets me to my question for you, which is, how do you think that the hybrid versus EV conversation fits into this demand forecast perspective for petroleum, where people are forecasting maybe peak demand by X date, like 2032?
My first answer to the question of, are we anywhere near peak demand, is really a question back to that says, are we near peak population? And until population growth globally begins to decline, I don't really see any change in the demand for petroleum products in the transportation sector. You look at countries like India, in the number of households, I think you shared with me, it's 6% of the Indian population has 7.5% has the ability to move themselves from point A to point B with their own vehicle. That there's the demand potential there that is absolutely dwarfs anything that could shift in the way of more efficient vehicles. Because you can look at the efficiency side in a lot of ways. What is the most efficient? Is it just making all combustion vehicles have a required minimum miles per gallon? There's been work done there. And I think that's really been one of the more tangible erosions to the growth in petroleum demand, is just saying, hey, we can do it better. It doesn't have to be this inefficient. There's a sweet spot. I need this much power in this kind of vehicle, and not having the amount of horsepower in, say, a vehicle that's moving mom and a couple kids to soccer practice that I would have in a vehicle that's transporting 7,000 pounds of rocks in the back to a job site.
Right.
So I think there's the efficiency side there. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the EVs, to me, what is still not adequately quantified is, what's the petroleum consumption that's going to be required to build out all of the infrastructure necessary to reach that pie in the sky view of 50% EV penetration in any nation, much less the entire world. Efforts have been made, and I think you've even done some work on it. And when I hear the answers to that question come back, I hear Charlie Brown's teacher talking, because it's just really hard for me to trust that anybody could really wrap their head around how much petroleum is required to build that many more power lines, that many charging stations, and on. And I think they're in the middle, like what you pointed out, that data on the true hybrids, and unpacking the psychology a little bit of who are the buyers, who's the EV buyer versus who's the hybrid buyer. This personal opinion here, disclaimer, I have a tendency to believe that the EV buyer in some ways wants to do what their neighbor's doing because it looks cool. They've convinced themselves they're saving the world and their upper middle class income, and have bought into the idea that if I do this, I'm making the world a better place for my grandkids. Again, without really truly understanding in any way what's the demand impact for power, which inherently has a read through to fossil fuel demand. And then in the middle is the hybrid buyer. To me, that is the psychology there. It's somebody that says, yeah, I like the idea of being more efficient, both economically in my household, in terms of the societal impact. And I need to trust that it truly is a reliable technology. I have to be able to move myself. The person that buys the EV, when their EV doesn't work, they just flip up their phone and order up an Uber and off they go. The hybrid buyer is, I believe, from a psychological perspective, looking for more self-reliance. And I would expect that slow and steady growth rate continues. And that back to the low end of the spectrum of, can we just make the combustion engine more efficient? Or what I think make more sense and have over, say, 5 decades, a material impact on what fossil fuel demand really looks like. But then in the background, I'll go back to my starting point of, well, what's population in the world? The other thing that must be understood in this is, if population continues to grow and we get more vehicles of any kind on any road, we're going to continue to have to rebuild our roads and build more roads. And that is also a big fossil fuel demand driver.
Yeah, and there's really a few interesting points that you made there. So on the efficiency side, one of the contextual points that we've put out recently is just the efficiency gains for the U.S. light-duty passenger fleet. So going from, say, 2005 to 2023, these are approximate numbers. I can go back and look, but just for approximate numbers, it was about 34% more efficient for internal combustion engines over that 18-year period. So pretty considerable gain, and that's reflected in per capita consumption. We've seen that. You go from basically, say, 25 and a half barrels per capita in the early 2000s for the US to about 20 and a half in 2023. So we're seeing that. To your point about the population growth and some of these other decision factors for EVs versus hybrids, et cetera, one of the other dynamics that I think really adds to it is that it's a geographic issue as well. So the US is a massive country. We have some of these social processes embedded in our culture where US, you're driving a long way a lot of the time, either for trips or for just getting from your job. Like when I was playing sports, whatever, that's a 3-hour trip to go to another small town in Texas to go play a game. That's going to be pretty hard for people to do with an EV in the current state. But when you look at something like China or some of these other regions that have maybe strategic compromise from relying on oil imports through, in China's case, the Strait of Malacca, they have a lot of incentives to go to a system like EVs. And there's also the consideration of, okay, you're in a city. It's much easier to go with an EV than it is to go with something like a hybrid. So I think that for the US, we're in that intersection where cities are the adopters for EVs.
That makes perfect sense. And then I think that raises the topic of, there is the population itself. How many people are there? But then where do they choose to live? And where one has the choice, and drive the southeastern United States right now and tell me how many New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York license plates. Inherently, you're going from more concentrated areas to less concentrated areas. And as that dynamic spreads, if it does, you're just changing miles traveled. I think when looking at the efficiency, we also have to look at any projections on how many miles do we expect each consumer of some form of energy traveling to actually move themselves.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a little bit of a transition point when we're talking about this demand side or supply side. In recent weeks, we've been seeing, not even in recent weeks, in a longer time frame, a lot of commentary about oversupply and undersupply. And I think that maybe deserves a little bit of a closer look.
In my wheelhouse, thank you. In commodity markets, broadly, this is not specific to energy. We'll stay in our lane and certainly keep it with energy. But that is the prevailing question of the day. Are we oversupplied? Are we undersupplied? And just to begin with, I think it's important to really find someone that you can trust and does the work to quantify over or undersupply. Like the verbiage, all fine and good. But what is that based on? And how is it measured? How is it consistently tracked? So I'll dissect from a high level natural gas and then oil. In natural gas, if you're going to determine over or under supply, there's a couple of things to consider. Absolute inventory levels, certainly. There's the starting point. In the lower 48, we began the summer 24 injection season with about 400 BCF more gas in the ground than we did the prior year. One would say we are oversupplied. That is true. It's a simple one minus the other, oversupplied versus the prior year. But then there's also, well, actually, I'll pause for a minute, that excess gas versus prior year period is down to 124 BCF as of the October 10th EIA inventory report. So it's dwindled materially. And then you look at long-term averages. Where is the current inventory level, say, versus the past 5 years or the past 10 years? There's another metric. But in the background for natural gas, what must always be considered is where are we on a weather-adjusted basis? My long-standing quip is that Mother Nature's undefeated, and she always will be. When you've lived through 5 warm winters in a row, it's not surprising to have the market feeling as if it's oversupplied. Now, mind you, in those 5 years falls 2022, when North America, much like the rest of the world, found itself in a BTU crisis, behaving as if we were definitively undersupplied. On a weather-adjusted basis, meaning stripping out the effect of heating degree days or cooling degree days, the summer of 22, when we priced up to $10 and often traded between 7 and 9, we were actually weather-adjusted oversupplied. Since the spring of 23, we have definitively been undersupplied, meaning strip out the effects of HDDs, heating degree days, or CDDs, cooling degree days. We have been undersupplied. 2023, 2.4 BCF per day. 2024 year to date, 1.9 BCF per day undersupplied. But in the natural gas market, there's one point that you can leave with and know that this will ultimately drive market pricing. Are we going to withdraw more than we inject in the summer? And then what's our expectation for the subsequent injection season? We're very near the conclusion of the summer 24 injection season, and we will likely have put in somewhere between 1.5 and 1.6 TCF. On a weather-adjusted basis, our projection for winter 24-25 is a withdrawal of 2.3 to 2.4 TCF. We take out more than we put in. That's undersupply. Mm-hmm. And the market, like I said, has over the past couple of years for sure, certainly priced as if we were oversupplied. That's absolute inventory levels up against some perceived constraint of how much could be stored. Because each of those past 5 winters, if you adjusted for the effects of weather, the withdrawal would have been between 2.3 and 2.4 TCF. So our projection for this coming winter is not some paradigm shift because of the forthcoming increase in LNG exports. It's just simply that's what a normal withdrawal will be right now. Mm-hmm. And we have not seen a normal build meet that sort of level. And certainly, as we know, back to that point of forthcoming LNG exports, that we can comfortably inject between, say, 2.3 and 2.4. So I'll put a pin in that for natural gas and invite any listeners to follow up with us. Any questions?
Yeah, just to recap real quick some of those numbers. So just 2020, you said 2022, 2023 winter was one number, and 2024, 2025 is another number, or maybe 2023, 23, 24 was your first. Can you just say those one more time?
Sorry. Yeah. So the summer 24 injection, so April through October injection, summer of 24 is most likely, without some catastrophic surprise, we will have injected between 1.5 and 1.6 TCF. So that's summer of 24. And then the winter that begins November 1 in the good old natural gas market, we call winters November through March, and we call summers April through October. This forthcoming winter, we will likely withdraw between 2.3 and 2.4 TCF on normal weather. And what we've seen over the past 2 years is Mother Nature is undefeated. When it is warmer than normal, there is a lot less withdrawn, and we very well could have a flat summer build versus winter withdrawal. Now that would be a 3 standard deviation warm winter, but it can happen.
Okay. So I definitely have some more questions on the gas side, but I think that there's maybe more to discuss on the oil oversupply, undersupply, if you want to dig into that first.
So sure. I'll just take the DOE's numbers and start with the broad theme of how are you measuring oversupply, undersupply? Simplistically in the oil markets, because there are always less days of supply, there is not the storage for the peak demand in the winter like is required in natural gas markets. So let's just use the idea of there's 30 days of available supply. Debatable, pick your country, pick your part of the world, but it's a relatively small number of days relative to the natural gas market, where in North America, in theory, there has to be 150 days of extra supply to make it through the winter. In oil, what you can look at is one of two things. Just simplistically, where is my supply right now versus my demand right now? When demand is higher than supply, we are undersupplied. Simple calculation. Mm-hmm. But then also, in adding a layer of complexity to it, is where are we year over year? Is, the demand growth going to exceed the supply growth? When you look at the latest short-term energy outlook from the DOE, you've got 2024 oil supply at 102.1 million barrels per day. The year's not over yet, but that's the projection. That compares to prior year supply of 101.9 million barrels per day globally. Relatively similar numbers, kind of flat supply. We know what OPEC's done to certainly help supply stay static. And then the DOE says that demand went from 102.15 million barrels per day in 23 up to 103 million barrels per day in 24. Again, the year is not over, but that's the actual plus projection. So that would say that supply is static, demand is going up. We are undersupplied by a significant margin. That would say we're 1 million barrels per day undersupplied globally. Now, there's a little bit of a problem there, though, when you look around the world at global inventories. Through June, the reported OECD inventory levels were 19 million barrels lower year over year. That does not correspond to 1 million barrels per day undersupplied. You can add in global floating stocks, which are significantly lower year over year. Latest data, which does have a long history of being revised higher, meaning the last 18 months, some significant upward revisions. But presently, meaning in early October, global floating stocks are 25 million barrels lower year over year. 19 plus 25, 44 million barrels. That does not seem to correspond with 1 million barrels per day undersupplied. And so there's a little bit of a data issue there. So am I overestimating demand? Am I underestimating supply? For our clients, please take a close look at our strategy deck this week, where we pick apart some of the large U.S. oil producers versus the DOE's reported production numbers. And there's a little bit of a discrepancy there worth considering. But then for the broader public that may be listening, you look forward at the projections for 2025, and the estimates are that supply will average 104.6 million barrels per day, or up 1.5 million barrels per day year over year. And demand will be 104.6 million barrels per day. So there's that conundrum. It's this multivariate equation. I'm like, well, wait a minute, 104.6 and 104.6, the market's balanced. Demand equals supply. But when you look at the year over year changes, I've got them, effectively going up the same. No real answer here. I think what to leave the readers with, or leave the listeners with, is it takes someone that is consistently picking apart weekly and monthly supply and demand data, inventory data, to have some grasp on what does the projection look like going forward? Where are the hiccups along the way? And, therein, I think is, really what we're on the precipice right now. And I'm sure we'll get to it at some point before we conclude, but events in the Middle East are adding a layer of complexity to the question of, will we be oversupplied, undersupplied? And are we oversupplied or undersupplied?
Yeah. So actually, I think that'd be a good place to finish it. Before we do that, I want to return to some of the things that you mentioned on natural gas to maybe just take a closer look. As we are speaking right now, I'm seeing November Henry Hub at basically 264. And that's come off from where we were last week. And so I guess I would like to hear your thoughts on what do you think is driving natural gas markets right now, considering maybe some of these forecasts for colder winters in certain regions or maybe warmer regions in certain regions.
Yeah, there's colder forecasts or some colder leans for Europe and Asia. And certainly you look back to 22 and you can see what happens when European and Asian markets begin to really rally. The North American market gets drug along for the ride. A global BTU crisis is a global BTU crisis. Unless you somehow remove yourself from the globe, you're a part of it. So not to say that European and Asian weather won't ultimately have some role this winter, but presently, when you bring up where the November contract is trading currently, so approximately 40 cents lower than where it was at its recent peak, it made a run towards $3 an MMBTU. Certainly, we've pulled back. I think there's a couple factors at play there. The natural gas market got very short in August with the idea that we were going to run into congestion risks in the fall. And it was a bit of a surprise to us. None of the data at the time, meaning inventory data, would have suggested that we were going to run into inventory constraints, yet the market positioned itself for that. So part of the rally in recent weeks has been driven by an unwinding of those short positions. And so, you make a move with the very front of the curve rising relative to the back. And that is the logical behavior. When you're in some historically steep contango, you begin to flatten the curve out some. And now, why have we backed off? Some of the short-term gains made by those that were pressuring the short positions get paired. And why would they get paired? The current short-term, meaning 15-day weather forecast, has, after this next week, which is cooler than normal along the eastern third of the country, a pretty pronounced warm-up. And if we are going to be warmer than normal, again, Mother Nature is undefeated. And the currently estimates for winter weather in North America are warmer than normal by approximately 150 heating degree days, or the equivalent of about 300 BCF of lost demand. Now, weather forecasts are probably a little better than a coin flip, but not a lot. Hardest job in the world, or easiest, depending upon your perspective. Hard to get it right, or easy because nobody really expects you to get it right. So we're back down here. And I would say the one thing that's more relevant than November going from $3 down to $2.60 is the fact that the March-April spread, or a spread that's often used in the gas market to signify whether the market has a fear of running out of gas, March is the end of winter, or a fear of running out of places to put gas. The wider that spread is, meaning the greater the premium March has over April, the more you're in a "I'm afraid we're going to run out" scenario. The narrower it is, the more you're worried about where am I going to put it if I have the extra. And presently, meaning in early to mid-October, we're at about half of the spread that we had last year. And at barely over a dime, we are historically low for this time of year, meaning you're not going to find many observations at all where, certainly without inventory constraints being still a topic of discussion, to have a March-April spread of less than 25 cents. Mind you, in cold winters, that can be multiple dollars wide. In conclusion, jury's still out. Interestingly, the market can go from a benign pricing environment, and in as little as a few weeks, we could find ourselves near Thanksgiving And if we've shifted, or actually if we've stayed in the colder than normal pattern that is on track for next week on the eastern seaboard and up into kind of areas not too far east of Chicago, then the rally will be on again later this winter, meaning near the turn of the year. If it has been cooler than normal in Europe and Asia, and it looks like it's going to stay that way, there could be a knock-on effect in the North American natural gas pricing.
Nice. Okay, that was great. And I think that bringing it closer to the present moment in oil and crude markets, we are dealing with the Middle East conflict. So last Tuesday, we had the Iran missile barrage on Israel that had a pretty material reaction with shorts uncovering or covering or unwinding. Following that, where do you see that shifting now? If we see those shorts exhausted, what should we think about after that?
So we're recording this on Friday, October 11th. Will be published early next week. So by the time you're listening to this, something may very well have already occurred. There's a very consistent history of the salvos occurring over weekends, weekend warriors, if you will, in the Middle East. So if there is a direct attack on Iranian oil infrastructure, which President Joe Biden actually said in a statement that there were discussions about that exact thing occurring, then there would certainly be a logical read through to pricing at the front of the WTI curve, which has rebounded from mid 60 levels. And more importantly, the curve has steepened, meaning backwardation from whether it be the front month, Cal 25 versus Cal 26. You pick your tenors, you're going to see some steepening in the curve. It's a more orderly curve than the natural gas market typically behaves in, a more orderly manner. I think the expectation should be that without direct effects on Iranian oil infrastructure, there should be little to no effect. And if anything, we could begin to see some of that premium fade back out of the market in the near term. It's priced such that it is expecting, and you've seen that in vol markets too, where implied vol has gone up, and that benefits the crude producer who's got a far better opportunity to mitigate risk through option structures than they have in really the past 18 months. And where do we go from here? Most of the listeners will really be keyed in on where's the front month contract trading. The possibility of being $10 higher almost requires the direct attack on Iranian oil infrastructure. And to be $10 lower, it could simply just be the passage of time without anything occurring.
Right. Yeah, because it's really that big question that we've been talking about of where are these incremental barrels going to be going? Who wants them?
And it's an interesting time too, politically. The political ties between the U.S. and Israel are storied. No different today, maybe, than they have been since the inception of the Israeli state. And how does Israel choose to respond to Iran's actions with an upcoming U.S. presidential election? Yeah, I made a comment to a client earlier this week, and my statement was that in some ways, maybe this is just a little minor back and forth, not minor, obviously, for the citizens of any of the nations that are unfortunately caught in this crossfire. Our thoughts, prayers, and hearts go out to the citizens of Lebanon, Israel, Iran, Iraq, who's had attacks on its soil. But as governments and as military forces take action against one another, and with this political backdrop being heated, it very well may be a turn of the year or near our inauguration day before something material happens.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a good cliffhanger in some ways to leave it on. And as with past weeks, some of the data heavy pieces that we talked about with EVs and nuke stuff and some of these other points, we'll throw those in the footnotes here or show notes, and readers can or listeners can go and access those. But as always, great chatting with you, Zane.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks for joining us at the Energy Desk. Again, this is a limited series. So if you want to hear more episodes, you'll have to let us know by hitting follow wherever you get your podcasts, or by sending me a message at Melvin at mobiusriskgroup.com. See you soon. And please keep in mind, this commentary contains our views and opinions and is based on information from sources we believe are reliable. This commentary is for informational purposes, should not be considered investment advice, and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase and sale of commodity interests, or to serve as the basis for one to decide to execute derivatives or other transactions. This commentary is not considered promotional material.